Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. Before we dive into our next segment, I want to remind you guys one last time on today's show. If you have any questions or comments you want to make, please use the tip and donations link, gsmcpodcast.net, that you see on your screen. By using that link, I'm able to see your question pop up in my chat box. I'll read it out loud and on air, obviously, and just get your guys' perspective and point of view on anything I say or any of the topics we talk about. It's a massive help for this show. So again, if you would, please use the tip and donations link, gsmcpodcast.net, with any questions or comments that you may have throughout the rest of today's episode. But in saying that, we'll move on and continue on with more schedule talk, carrying over from last weekend, obviously from the last segment, focusing in on the Pittsburgh Steelers schedule in 2024. I mentioned it before when I had my reaction to the schedule, how the Steelers have the third hardest schedule in the NFL, just behind the Baltimore Ravens and the Cleveland Browns. And it is very difficult towards the end of the season. If you haven't heard anybody else talk about it, the end of the Steelers schedule is very difficult, and I thought I'd come on here, lay out the groundworks, the facts of the schedule, and then we'll talk about the question on hand that now is generated from such a difficult schedule. Will this be the Steelers' first losing season under Mike Tomlin? It does have a good case for being it. I won't lie to you guys. This schedule, just in terms of the facts of it, the Steelers will have 10 games against teams with a winning record. Only 2 of the first 8 games that are on their schedule are against winning record teams, so a lot of those difficult games are already pushed towards the back end after their bye week in Week 9. The only teams with the winning record that they play in their first 8 games are the Colts in Week 5 and also the Dallas Cowboys. And moving on with that, 4 of their first 6 games are also on the road, so even if 2 of the 8 games were only teams with winning records, 4 of them of their first 6 are on the road. So you look at games against the Falcons is on the road, at Denver, at Indianapolis, and at Las Vegas. Teams with not winning records, but they're on the road regardless, so there's always a level of difficulty with that. And looking at it, you play the Jets at home also, and with the Atlanta Falcons as well. Yeah, they had losing records, but they didn't have proper quarterback play, to say the least, in 2023. So now the Steelers will essentially play Kirk Cousins, Aaron Rodgers, and Anthony Richardson with the Indianapolis Colts. Even though they lost to the Colts last year, now they'll get even better with having their starting quarterback in there. So that is also tougher. Now you look at their schedule after their Week 9 bye. They'll play on the road against the Washington Commanders, and then they'll face the Baltimore Ravens and the Cleveland Browns over a 5-day period. They'll host the Baltimore Ravens in Week 11, and then they'll travel to Cleveland for that same week Thursday game. So they'll play on Sunday, and then just a few days later, we'll play on Thursday at Cleveland. And on that topic, they won't play their first divisional game until that Week 11 game against the Baltimore Ravens, and after that, they'll play 4 consecutive AFC North games. So you start with the Ravens, and then Week 12, Week 13, and Week 14 are all filled up with AFC North games. That's something I've really never heard of. Playing your first divisional game until Week 11 is pretty ridiculous, especially talking about the AFC North and how all those teams are in playoff contention. Any of those teams are capable of making the playoffs. So to have it stacked up there towards the end, when you're already playing a lot of other tough teams in the back half of the season, is extremely difficult, but it is, again, how the schedule panned out for the Steelers. But also moving on with more on their schedule. Starting in Week 15, the Steelers will play 3 games in a 11-day period. They'll play at Philadelphia on December 15th. Then they'll play at Baltimore on December 21st before hosting the Kansas City Chiefs just 4 days after that on Christmas. So not only do they have limited rest, they play at Philadelphia. That got even better this offseason. At Baltimore, which is always tough, obviously, and they'll host the reigning Super Bowl champions, Kansas City Chiefs, on Christmas Day. All 3 of those teams had a combined 35 wins in 2023, so hard to think that they'll be worse than they are or than they were in 2023. And also, their final 8 games are against teams with a winning record. The Washington Commanders would be the last opponent they play throughout their season without a winning record. Even Cincinnati had a winning record of 9-8 last year, but they'll be the only team that they play in their last 8 games that didn't make the playoffs. So not only will they be playing their final 8 games against winning record teams, but all of them, except the Bengals, made the playoffs. So that just adds on even more to it. And I mentioned their Week 11 game is the first time they play their divisional opponents. So that's 6 divisional games of their final 8 games being against the AFC North. So if you break it down a little bit here, of their final 8 games, 6 of them will be divisional games, AFC North opponents, and the other 2 that won't be divisional games are against the Eagles and the Chiefs. So in that period, if you really think about it, you play Deshaun Watson twice, you play Lamar Jackson twice, you play Joe Burrow twice, you play Jalen Hurts, and you play Patrick Mahomes. An unbelievable gauntlet there to end the year for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And not to mention, on top of that, they have a new offensive coordinator, essentially new left and right tackles, trying to figure out the wide receiver position. You obviously have new quarterbacks in there to try and get used to the team. Not the recipe you'd want to have to think that you would make the playoffs or have a winning record this year. But I'm here to tell you that they will have a winning record. They will have a winning record, and they will not finish last in the AFC North because the Ravens and the Browns also have extremely tough schedules. That's one thing. But also, it can't get worse than it was last year in 2023. If you didn't watch any of the Steelers games, good for you, because they were awful. The quarterback play, I don't have to speak on much of it on this episode. That was really the national news around the Steelers, trying to figure out their quarterback play, bringing in Mitchell to replace Kenny Pickett. Then Mason Rudolph comes in because Trubisky isn't good enough. And in totality, all 3 of those quarterbacks for the Steelers threw a combined 13 touchdowns between all 3 of them. 13 between all 3 of them, I think. And they had 13 interceptions. So you have 13 touchdowns from 3 quarterbacks on your team and 9 interceptions. Not a great ratio for one quarterback. To say it was all 3 is absurd, ridiculous. It can't get worse than that with Russell Wilson coming in and Justin Fields. Russell Wilson, statistic-wise, just had a better year than all 3 quarterbacks combined, so that's one thing. With the competition of Justin Fields, I'm not saying both of them, whichever one starts will be in contention for making the All-Pro team or anything like that, but again, it just can't get worse than it was last year. And also, new offensive coordinator Arthur Smith, it should fit into their idea of trying to run the ball even more, which is something that they wanted to do. They've addressed some issues with that, drafting an offensive lineman in the first 2 rounds this year in Zach Frazier, and I can't believe I forgot the first round pick's name. It'll come to me, but they drafted in their first 2 picks in the draft. They drafted offensive linemen, they drafted a wide receiver, and also it is sort of funneling into that idea of trying to run the ball, being this nasty, winning both sides of the ball sort of team with the Steelers. And also looking back on it last year with how bad they played, they finished 5-1 against the AFC North. And I know Deshaun Watson, people will say, got hurt. Joe Burrow wasn't there. Obviously, that's a valid reason, Joe Burrow not being there. But against the Ravens as well, they beat them twice. They beat the Bengals twice, and they lost to the Browns in one of the games. So, again, as bad as they were, they had a good record against the division last year, and it will be difficult to make the playoffs with how good the Jaguars are. Maybe in there, the Bengals having an easier schedule than the other 3 teams in their division is something to point out to as well. So they are stacked against them. The odds are stacked against them. You have the New York Jets as well with Aaron Rodgers coming in, hopefully playing the entire season healthy. It won't be easy, but again, I have reasons to believe that it can't get any worse than it was last year. They have better quarterback play. I have to believe it can't get worse than 13 touchdowns and 9 interceptions between three guys than what it is that they have now. It's going to be hard. It's probably not going to be pretty at a lot of points in the season, but they won't have a losing record. And if they don't have a losing record and they beat some of these very challenging teams throughout the duration of their schedule, I have to believe that has some pedigree or that holds some value for them to make the playoffs if by week 12, week 11, when they start that extremely tough portion of their schedule, if they're in a good place, if they carve out a good window or margin of error there for themselves, I think they'll give themselves the chance, as they always do year after year under Mike Tomlin. It isn't anything new. The conversation will be had over and over again throughout the offseason, but that's how I feel on it. If you haven't really looked at the Steelers' schedule, I recommend doing so and getting a better understanding of how difficult this will be. But again, they will not have a losing record in 2024. You can quote me on that. We'll come back to this episode and I'll say I told you so. But for the remainder of this of today's show, we will go to the last break on today's episode, and when we come back, we'll talk about more schedule details, this time with the Baltimore Ravens and how they're not satisfied with how their schedule panned out. So stick around. We have one more segment to talk about on today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.